Scripture this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 13 through 20. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its saltiness, how will it become salty again? That's a good question. It's good for nothing except to be thrown away and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city on top of a hill can't be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a basket. Instead, they put it on top of a lampstand, and it shines on all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before people, so they can see the good things you do and praise your Father who is in heaven. But don't even begin to think that I have come to do away with the law and the prophets. I haven't come to do away with them, but to fulfill them. I say to you very seriously that as long as heaven and earth exist, neither the smallest letter nor the smallest stroke of a pen will be erased from the law until everything there becomes a reality. Therefore, whoever ignores one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called the lowest in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps these commands and teaches people to keep them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. I say to you that unless your righteousness is greater than the righteousness of legal experts and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And friends, this is the word of God for the people of God. You say with me, thanks be to God. Some of the most important things in our lives are the aspects of them that we usually don't think about, and at least until they're all of a sudden not working. We all know that feeling when you're sitting in your house, like just having a normal night, maybe like getting dinner ready, and then all of a sudden like the lights flicker, and you have just enough time to think, no, as the power cuts all the way out, and you've got to remember like which drawer you shoved the flashlight into the last time this happened, and you check your phone to see how much charge is left if you're going to go watching TV later, and then you figure out what you're going to do with the half-cooked meal on the stove. In that moment, we're very aware of how important electricity is, but most of the time it just kind of buzzes through the walls of our homes without us thinking about it. So there's this weird paradox where our lives are built around this material need, and our economy and the patterns of our whole world are likewise organized around it. But it's so important precisely because it allows us to do other things. And so that aspect of our lives and the networks of power that go into producing it are able to mask themselves. We don't have to think about them as long as they're working. Like if someone asks you, what's fulfilling your life? Unless you grew up somewhere without electricity, it would be really weird if you said, my light switches. I just love going home and just like playing the light switches. It's great. Or, like I'm in love with my fuse box. That evokes such deep meaning for me. Like you might talk about spending time with your friends or meals you share with people you love or entertainment like shows or books or movies, most of which in our world require electricity. But that's not the main event when we think about our lives. And I'm belaboring the point a little bit, I know, because I think this paradox is there in the metaphors that Jesus is giving us for our calling in this passage. Following Jesus means operating in those paradoxical spaces. It means naming the unnamed, thinking the unthought conditions of our lives, going to work in those places, sometimes to call attention to the way that they operate, to reveal what would rather remain suppressed, sometimes to create the conditions for people to enjoy their lives so that they don't have to think about those things. Jesus in this passage says that we're called to be salt and light. And I always thought this was an odd metaphor. I mean, light makes sense, so it's metaphysical, it's salt, why salt? But I think salt does a couple of things. Salt has always had a couple of functions in cooking. First of all, it's a preservative, right? In a time before refrigeration, especially, salt was really important and valuable for curing meat, fish, because it prevents corruption. It sucks the life out of whatever organisms would cause destruction in your food. It protects what's good and flavorful and nourishing. And in the cooking itself, salt accentuates flavors that are already there. This is why it's as good with hot chocolate as it is with steak. That's above and beyond church, our church topics this morning. You can go and try that later. The job of salt is not to be the main player in the dish. If you cook something and all you taste is salt, you've done something horribly wrong. It's important to me that we all know that. Its purpose is as a seasoning, to call attention to what's already flavorful in the other ingredients, not to make you notice itself. It's not supposed to be the main ingredient, but everything else kind of tastes flat when it's not there. And I think many of the same things are true of light. Light casts out shadows and it illuminates what's present in a place. Light by itself isn't visible. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to see anything. It has to reflect or refract from objects. We know it for what it is when it's calling our attention to other things. So like Jesus said, let your light shine before people so they see your good works. So we live like light when we cast out the shadows of each other's fears. When we tear down anything that is casting a shadow over each other's lives. We live like light when the grace we act out for each other shows the reality of God's grace. We live like salt when we suck the life out of the forces of corruption that break down each other's lives. And we live like salt when we join our neighbors in their works of justice and mercy without having to say, this is our thing. Our calling as Christians isn't to be the hero of anyone's story. As Christians, we're called to be the helpers, the leaven in the bread, the salt complementing the dish, the light, not the stained glass that shines through. Doing what we're called to do when we descend into the unnamed, unthought grit of each other's lives, not when we're the main characters. As a church, we don't need to be the kind of community of people everyone's always noticing and talking about, but we want to be the kind of community that people would really miss. And I think that difference is really important. The scripture that we're reading today has a really messed up history of being read in the opposite direction. Christians have used the idea of a city on a hill for centuries, really, to justify all kinds of violent practices and manipulative practices, and in particular, the conquest of indigenous peoples and their lands in what we now call North America. For a long time, white Christians read this passage and imagined themselves, ourselves, as the heroes of God's providence, as the new chosen people who would set up a new society. And that society would be a light to the nations in the way it showed everyone how successful holiness could be when God blessed the city on the hill with prosperity. And so being a city on a hill in this logic is kind of like being a billboard. It's basically a form of advertising. And if that's the case, then your neighbors and the stories that they tell are essentially competition that you have to defeat. You have to rise above them to a transcendent central position up on the hill, where you can gather everyone to yourself and tell the story you think they need to hear and conform their lives to. And if them hearing that story and submitting to that story is the most important thing, then the means by which you get the position to tell the story aren't as important as the story itself. The end justifies the means. And this kind of interpretation, this understanding of the city on the hill, historically is at the origins of both capitalism, which uses these mystifications to justify really real practices of extraction and exploitation. But it's also at the heart of whiteness, which is a kind of parody identity that defines itself by what it's not. Being white is not really an identity in itself, so much as a way of distancing oneself from being Black on one hand and in that time being Jewish on the other hand. So both capitalism, the practice of extracting ever more profit from the cheapest possible labor, and centralizing it into the hands of a few, and whiteness, which justifies those practices by imagining white flesh as a new elect who prove ourselves by new acts of conquest, Both of these aspects of the modern world come to be through this myth of transcendence, this idea of the city on the hill where we project out the advertising and marketing, the story of God, or a certain kind of God. And in this logic, it doesn't matter who gets hurt. It doesn't matter what we leave behind. It doesn't matter how we treat the land. It doesn't matter what material conditions shape our lives. What matters is the proclamation of the message from up on high. The billboard shouting, Jesus is Lord, without worrying that the very medium of the billboard also preaches, but mammon pays the bills. And these habits of thought are deeply, deeply ingrained in many of us today as well. Even if you vote blue no matter who, or you want AOC to be your next president, even if you know that you don't want to be a fascist, that those are bad guys, the myth of transcendence continues to operate in many of our imaginations. It's so easy for us to think of our way of being in the world in terms of style. That as long as I say the right things, or don't say the wrong things, and believe the right things, or don't believe the wrong things, like those bad evangelicals, and post the right things, and don't post the wrong things that get dunked on, then I'm one of the good ones. And then goodness, whether people mean by that being a Christian following Jesus, or being some kind of progressive subject, is essentially a matter of branding myself like that. In our case, it might be easy for some of us to think that we're good or interesting as a church because we're the church that talks about Marx. Or some people here might be annoyed by that because you want to talk about other things and we're not good until we send those signals for the things that you want to talk about. But in our case, I think it's important to remember that we started doing financial literacy to make sense of the practice we already had of paying off debts. And we think it's important to pay off debts, not because we want to style ourselves as the Bernie Bro Church, but because debt is one of those brutal material features of our world that ideology tries to mystify. It's one of these aspects of our lives that's always functioning beneath the surface, and we tell ourselves not to think about it, even though the stress of being indebted, of having to be in debt to pay for the things we need to live, is just constantly picking at us and causing untold damage to our bodies and our souls. And so if you want to work against narratives of transcendence, which always float above the fray of other people, which are always disintegrating true communion and intimacy with one another, if we want to work against the things that actually condition our lives, if we want to work against capitalism, if we want to work against whiteness, then we have to reject our own transcendence and join each other around the struggles where we actually have stakes. In many cases, whiteness in particular teaches us that we can be good without it costing us anything. The cost is always borne by someone else. There's a very interesting book called Racism Without Racists that gets into some of this analysis. And so working against whiteness in any tangible way means white people learning to let others make claims on this for the debts we owe. Otherwise, we're just repeating the same processes over and over again with different, more polite language. After Jesus tells the disciples that we're called to be salt and light, to enter into the crevices that we would rather ignore in the world, he reminds us that he has not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And in a typical transcendent abstraction, a lot of Christians have tended to make this passage a referendum on Judaism. This is where we decide whether Judaism is good or whether Judaism is bad. This is still that's a call to make. But I think it's important to realize that the actual content of the law is all about the material details of our lives. The law is all about how we get our food, how we use the land, the economies that produce our food, how we make our clothes and who makes our clothes, how we treat guests, and how we're supposed to pay off each other's debts. which just means others get to make claims on us. When Jesus talks about not forgetting the law, he's saying that we have opportunities to show each other grace, to show each other God's love in the material conditions of our lives. It's not about transcending the particularity of our food and our clothes and our jobs and the way we make money so that we all agree to these abstract principles. And as long as anybody agrees with those and tells the right story, then they're good. No. Remembering the law, fulfilling the righteousness of the law is about finding grace in the particularity of our lives that is pressing us down. Any community we create or any intimacy we feel is vain if we can't make claims on each other. And I think when Jesus gives that reminder, he's telling us something about what he means by being salt and light. He's calling us to return over and over again to those details of each other's lives that we'd rather live without noticing, that many of us think we have to suppress in order to be loved, that we have to suppress in order to be worthy of community. But my friends, our calling isn't to the heroic high places where everyone notices how great we are and so wants to be with us. Our calling is to the subtle mixing of flavors, which sometimes takes a long time and a lot of work. Our calling is to the shadowy places where we try to hide from each other and where we would even try to hide from ourselves in order to project an idea of goodness or worthiness. When it comes to the life of our church, I don't care if we read Marx together ever again. I don't care if you ever call yourself a socialist. That's not really what we're doing at church. What's important is that the story we tell about ourselves isn't the story we tell about ourselves or the branding of our community. But I think Jesus cares about whether you can make rent. I think Jesus cares about whether the hospital is sending you to collections. I think Jesus cares about whether you can find work. And I think Jesus cares about whether we can really share those worries together, or if we're going to shy away from making claims on one another, because that's how nice, respectable adults in the United States of America act. We don't have to be the church that we founded 3.5 years ago. We can go new places. We can try new things. We can admit when things didn't work. But we're always called to be salt and light. We're not just called to talk about grace. We're called to embody grace in tangible ways for one another. We're called to ward off the realities that corrupt our joys. And we're called to help each other's lives be as flavorful as possible, not just by talking about it, by tasting and seeing that the Lord is good, by making claims on each other. Because we know we owe each other nothing but love, but that means we also owe each other everything. So I don't know what you're struggling with this morning. I don't know what you'd rather not talk about. I don't know what you'd rather hide even from yourself. I don't know what you're keeping to yourself so that you can narrate your life in a polite way. Maybe you're just an open book, and that's not the case for you. It is for me. Not that I'm an open book. There's a lot of things. It's in those places. It's in those places where God's Spirit is with you. And that's exactly where the people of God, as the church, are called to shine a light, to add a little seasoning, to draw out the goodness that's already in your midst, and to stifle whatever is corrupting it. It's exactly in those aspects of our lives that are so basic we assume they're given, that God wants us to give each other the gift of grace.